calm night, an empty store. Come inside if you're looking for more. Take care, for there's a darkness, just not of light. There's no telling what beings can fool our sight. When I turned 21, I got a job at a convenience store and gas station about 40 miles outside of town. This was one of those run-down places with disgusting bathrooms and hot dogs under a heat lamp that you weren't sure were still in date, let alone consumable. This was the type of place you only stopped at if peeing on the side of the road was out of the question, or if your car was literally running on fumes. It definitely wasn't the ideal job, but I had just dropped out of college, and I was going nowhere fast. Not long before that, I had quit my job as a teller at the local bank. Needless to say, I was every bit the definition of a screw-up, and had very little going for me in the way of success. The gas station was as much about finding a job far outside of town, where it was unlikely anybody would find me or recognize me, as it was a need to make money, so I didn't wind up sleeping out of my car. Getting the job was a breeze. It was only 2 days ago that I'd gone in for the interview. I dressed in my best, which really isn't saying much, and did what I could to make it seem like I really had a passion for what I'd be doing. I can admit my perceived enthusiasm was disingenuous, but my options were limited, and I couldn't afford to miss out on this opportunity. As it happens, not many places are beating down the door to hire a college dropout who walked out of his last job with no notice. The interview went by faster than it took me to get ready for it in the first place. The owner, Mr. Phillips, a thin, ghostly-looking man who smelt of cedar and smoke, looked at me over the top of his sweat-stained glasses each time he read another line on my resume. I couldn't wait for this to be over, as the office smelt mildly of rotted fruit, and anything with a surface was stacked a mile high with old invoices and reports. As I watched him, I could tell he was running on only a few hours sleep, but I didn't ask any questions. I left that to him. Surprisingly, though, he only had one question and one statement for me. "When can you start?" And, "I've only got the night shift available. Take it or leave it." The idea of having to reverse my schedule to sleeping all day and being awake all night wasn't the most appealing thing in the world, but again, my options at this point were limited. And being on the opposite schedule as everyone else would severely mitigate the chance of me running into anybody I knew. I didn't hesitate. I accepted the job, but I couldn't help but feel like the whole situation was a little weird. I wasn't exactly a good bet, and while this was no 5-star hotel, I still would have thought that the owner would have done a little more due diligence in making sure I wasn't some kind of psycho. So, I had to ask when he stood up to shake my hand. "Any questions for me?" he asked with his gravelly voice, using one of his long, thin index fingers to push his glasses back onto his sweat-soaked nose. "Yeah, so first of all, I wanted to say thanks for the opportunity," I said, trying to think of the best way to ask without jeopardizing his decision. "But I did have one. You said you were having trouble keeping the night shift staffed. Well, I guess I was just curious why that is." He took a deep breath, quickly adjusting his glasses again. He hesitated a bit, as if trying to find convincing words to not make me rethink the whole situation. "Well, I mean, it's the night shift, kid. Combine that with crap pay and almost no customers, well, that makes for a pretty miserable time." We shared an awkwardly long glance, with an even more awkwardly long handshake that we still hadn't managed to break. He took another deep breath, obviously realizing that I wasn't convinced by his less than convincing fib. He shook his head as if fighting off his better judgment, and finally let go of my hand. "Okay, in all honesty, it's been a struggle to keep anybody out here because let's just be honest. Out here in the middle of the woods on a country road, it gets real quiet and real lonely." "Okay, I can understand that," I responded. "So, other folks just got too bored then?" The man took yet another pause. It was now becoming obvious that he was trying to be as honest with me as he could without revealing the truth. "All right, listen, full disclosure. I had a guy that worked for me on the night shift for almost 20 years. He began. A little over a month ago, he let me know that he was finally going to hang it up, retire. It sucked to lose him, but hey, everybody wants to retire eventually. I didn't think much of it. So not long after, I find somebody willing to step in as his replacement. Things went well for about a week, then all of a sudden, the lady starts calling in sick every other day. And before long, she just winds up quitting. After that, I hired another replacement. Mind you, every time one of these folks calls in, I'm the one who has to cover the shift. He didn't last much longer. Losing 2 people in less than a week and a half seems strange enough, so I confront the guy as he's telling me he won't be back. Basically, I just asked him what the deal was and why he's leaving me high and dry like this. He doesn't say much, just that he kept hearing things in the night, kept seeing things when no one was around, said he just couldn't take it anymore. That last bit set me on edge somewhat. The owner continued talking, but I tuned out a lot of what he was saying and quickly interrupted him with another question. So, what was he hearing and seeing then? Mr. Phillips looked at me, baffled, with a subtle shake of his head. What was he seeing and hearing? Nothing. He was clearly just sleep deprived, got a little spooked by the quiet, and just couldn't take it anymore. It happens, but that still makes a problem for me. So you up for it or not? I could tell he was beginning to become frustrated by my line of questioning. I didn't think it was unreasonable to see if anything that the previous employee was going through was legitimate, but I didn't want to push my luck any further. I accepted the job without any more objection, shook the owner's hand, and agreed to start the following night at 11 p.m. I ran home that evening, planning to stay up as long as I could and to sleep as late as I could the next day to try to get myself on the right schedule. I did pretty well, sleeping until almost 4 p.m. the next afternoon. As I prepared to head in for my first shift, I couldn't help but feel just a little bit on edge. I'll admit that the idea of being out in the middle of nowhere with absolutely nobody else around in the middle of the night wasn't the most comforting of scenarios. But now the idea of potentially hearing voices and maybe seeing shadows had me feeling a little nervous, to say the least. I needed the job though, so I did my best to block out the thoughts. I grabbed my dinner, my jacket, and my best pair of noise-canceling headphones and headed out of town for my new job. Luckily, one of the perks of the job was the free gas, so the long commute wasn't a problem. When I got there, I met Joe, the guy who worked the evening shift before me. He wasn't the friendliest of people, and he didn't have a whole lot to say, but he ran through some of the housekeeping duties that I would need to handle while I had some downtime. And then he reminded me just how much downtime I would have. Not long after, he shook my hand and started to leave for the evening before I stopped him. Hey, Joe? Yeah, what you need? He responded with just a hint of irritation in his voice. I figured he was probably ready to get home after a long day. When Mr. Phillips hired me, well, he mentioned that the last couple of folks didn't last long. Because they were seeing things and hearing things? You haven't noticed anything like that around here, have you? Joe looked out the window toward his car in the parking lot. I wondered what was going through his head, as he was more than likely annoyed that he was wasting even 1 second of his time entertaining my dumb question. I don't know what I expected him to say, but what he did say didn't give me much solace. Now don't you go tricking your own head into making yourself see and hear things that aren't really there. It'll be a long night if you start letting every little sound and every little shadow that passes by get to you. Understand? He nodded his head at me with the same look my dad used to give me every time I failed another test. The silence took longer than felt comfortable, and I didn't know what to say, so I basically just bid him farewell. Okay, well, see you tomorrow then. He gave me a curt nod and exited the door as the bell jingled on his way out. He hopped in his car that didn't look like it was in much better shape than mine, and flipped around on the road as gravel flew up behind his spinning tires. I stared around at the store, listening to the soft buzzing of the fluorescent lights above my head. I found myself dwelling a lot on what Joe had told me before he walked out. No denial, not even an incredulous wave of an old man's hand to suggest it was all nonsense. It was just a basic admonition. Don't pay attention to anything you might see or hear. I pulled out the chore sheet Mr. Phillips left me and went about getting those done as quickly as I could. I wanted to stay busy and not think so much about the quiet of the night. In any other circumstance, this would be a bachelor's paradise. Getting paid to basically do nothing, nobody to bother you, and all of the free soda and snacks you could possibly imagine. But these were definitely not ordinary circumstances. Once I'd completed the chore sheet, I really didn't have much else to do other than sit around and wait on customers. But as expected, there weren't any customers up to this point. And based on what I'd been told, I don't know that I really expected anybody to show up at all. Eventually, I pulled out my headphones and connected them to my phone. I pulled up some cheesy comedy, just something to make me laugh a little bit while I waited out the time. After a while, I'd completely lost myself in the film, laughing with the bad jokes. All of a sudden, my eyes shot to the door as I thought something had passed through my peripheral vision, and I could have sworn I heard the faint jingle of the doorbell over my headphones. I was surprised to see nothing and no one there, but as I passed back over to the store, I could see the large end cap where the chips would have been was completely knocked over. Chip bags were everywhere. I rushed around the counter and began to clean it all up, not even thinking about what could have caused the mess in the first place. but it didn't take long for that very question to enter my mind. Had somebody rushed in while I was focused on my phone and stolen all the chips they could get their arms around? That'd be perfect. Getting fired my first night on the job because I was too focused on my phone and allowed someone to steal a bunch of merchandise. But then the thought struck me. I could go see what happened on the surveillance video. I dropped the chips I had in my arm and left the mess for later. I locked the front door, ran to the back room where the video equipment was, and quickly navigated to the correct timestamp. I felt a rush of heat run to my face and a warm, sick feeling take over my stomach as I watched the events unfold in front of me. I rewound the footage to make sure I wasn't going crazy. I could see myself sitting behind the counter, my headphones placed over my ears, and sitting on a chair while I looked slightly down at my phone. Soon after, two figures clad in black clothing appeared from the bottom of the screen. They walked up to the counter, both stopping to stare at me for several minutes. Within inches of my face, there was no way I wouldn't have seen them. My heart began to beat even faster in my chest. After about 5 minutes of silent staring, one of them walked around the counter and stood behind me, while the other walked over next to the end cap full of chips. My blood ran cold. The figure stood over me like an evil angel. The footage was grainy, but I could vaguely see the horrid face from underneath the hood as he stared over me silently. It was pale white, as were its uncovered hands. He did nothing but stand behind me. A couple minutes later, the other one standing next to the chips very suddenly and violently pulled the end cap off of its threading and threw it, sending bags of chips flying everywhere. Almost simultaneously, they vanished into thin air, and the front door flew open, ringing the bell. I watched myself as I looked up and stared around the store in astonishment, surveying the situation before disappearing out at the bottom of the screen when I'd left to go and check the cameras. I fell back into the old upholstered chair as it squealed loudly underneath me. I shut my eyes, contemplating what I must have seen and who the figures could have been. It was then that I heard another crash come from back inside the store. I got up slowly and leaned out into the hallway, looking from side to side. But there was nothing there. No dark figures, no mess. It was as if nothing had happened at all. But by this point, I was on high alert regardless. I stood vigilantly in the tiny hallway, realizing this was where the figures would have originated from. But there was nothing there either. There was an emergency exit, but that could only be opened from the inside. Wherever they came from, it wasn't through that door. It didn't take me much longer to draw back to the conversations I'd had with Mr. Phillips and with Joe earlier that night. The previous employees had quit unexpectedly because they were beginning to see and hear things. Just then, the fluorescent light bulbs that ran across the ceiling of the building all burst simultaneously, completely snuffing out what little light there was to begin with. By this point, it was no wonder to me why the previous employees couldn't take any more. In all honesty, I wasn't far behind them. I felt like I was going crazy. I couldn't tell if I was just imagining it all. Maybe I was just sleep deprived. At this point, I didn't know what to do. There was shattered glass all throughout the store. There hadn't been a customer all night anyway, and I was scared out of my mind. I cowered in the hallway, trying to gain the resolve to do something, anything, but I was so paralyzed by fear. I couldn't think straight. I closed my eyes and took a few deep breaths, repeating in my head what Joe had said to me earlier. Don't let the perceived sights and sounds get to me. I kept breathing, convincing myself that when I opened my eyes, all would be normal again, just like the end cap of chips. There would be no shattered bulbs, no store in disarray. I had to have imagined it at all. I finally felt my heart rate begin to slow, and I started to believe it really was just in my head. I opened my eyes, expecting to see nothing, only to scream in absolute terror. At the end of the hallway, only a couple of feet in front of me, I saw the two figures standing, as if waiting for me. I leapt to my feet, taking my vision away only momentarily, but in that time, they had vanished again. The fear returned to me with a vengeance. My heart was racing, my hands shaking, and my uncontrollable breathing felt like it was going to make me pass out from lack of oxygen. I began to run, hearing the crunching of the broken glass beneath my boots. As I raced through the store, everything inside began to fly around like a tornado was blowing through. I screamed again, hoping I could just make it to the door. But then suddenly I was knocked off my feet by something I couldn't see. A strong, powerful presence that tossed me across the room like a rag doll. I slid into the counter, banging my head against the wooden structure. Just like that, everything had stopped. There were no more things flying through the air, and the cacophony of noises were instantly silenced. Slightly woozy, I grabbed the back of my head and groaned in pain. I needed to get to the door. As I prepared to get to my feet, I heard the sound of crunching glass just above my head. I turned slowly, looking back to see a dark, shadowy figure staring down at me from atop the counter. A ravenous snarl emanated from its pale face that I could barely see. It crouched over me, its long spider-like fingers reaching down as if to grab me. It felt as though my soul was leaving my body. Somehow, I summoned the strength in my fearful stupor to get to my feet and run for the door. I unlocked it, burst through it, and ran as fast as I could through the parking lot and out to the road. I didn't even think to stop for my car, being afraid to stop my progress for even a second. Several minutes passed as I ran along the road, breathing heavily as if I was having a full-blown panic attack, till finally, I came upon a set of lights from a car that was about to pass me. I waved it down frantically, praying they would be willing to pick me up, and to my surprise and utter gratitude, they did. I hopped in as they drove me back in the direction I'd just come from. "What's going on, son?" the stranger asked. "Everything okay?" I took a few more deep inhales, trying to catch my breath and doing the best I could to not frighten the best chance I had at getting away. "No," I said through quickened breaths. "Could you please just take me to the police station?" The stranger looked at me worried, but finally agreed. The next minute or so was mostly silence before I saw the convenience store begin to come into view. I looked over at it ominously, seeing my car sitting lonely in the parking lot. I'd come back for it when there was light. The stranger must have noticed me looking, though, as he turned toward the building himself. "Ah, yeah, the old snack stop," he said. "Creepy, isn't it?" "Yeah, creepy. They say that place is haunted," he said with a laugh. "Can't imagine why," I responded sarcastically. The stranger easily picked up on the sarcasm and turned to me as if waiting for an answer. He shook his head before saying, "What do you mean? You been in there or something?" "Yeah," I said. "Tonight was my first night on the night shift. But let's just say it was my first and last night." The stranger looked at me as if I were crazy. Then he scoffed as if he were waiting for me to break character. But then his face got serious again. "Son, I don't know if you're trying to mess with me, but that store ain't been in business for over 20 years. My heart began to race again as I looked back out through the windshield and into the black nothingness. I said nothing more, neither did the stranger, as we drove aimlessly into the dark of the night.